The day my mother stood beside my grandmother's lawyer and told him, with a steady voice and absolutely no hesitation, that I had no legal claim to anything in that estate, I was sitting 3 chairs away. I heard every word. I watched the lawyer write something down in his yellow legal pad. I watched my mother smooth her skirt and give my sister a small, satisfied nod, the kind of nod that passes between people who have already agreed on the answer before the question was even asked. I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid, and not because I was weak. I stayed quiet because I already knew something they didn't. Something my grandmother had made sure of 21 years before that morning, in a county clerk's office 40 minutes from the house we were all fighting over, on a Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 2003, when I was 9 years old and had no idea she was doing it. If you're new here, stay with me. This story takes a minute to build, but I promise you it pays off in a way that I still can't fully believe actually happened to me. And before I go any further, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love knowing who's out there. My name is Marisol. I am 30 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the South, in a house my grandparents built in the 1970s from a combination of savings, stubbornness, and the kind of quiet ambition that immigrant families carry in their bones because they have no other choice. My grandmother, Lourdes, everyone called her Lola, which is what we call grandmothers in Filipino families, was the kind of woman who kept receipts for everything. Not just grocery receipts. She kept receipts for acts of kindness, for favors extended and favors owed, for promises made in front of witnesses, and for the things people said when they thought she wasn't listening. She was small and soft-spoken and she made the best arroz caldo I have ever tasted in my life, and she was also, quietly, the sharpest person in every room she ever walked into. My grandfather, Ronaldo, died when I was 7. He left behind the house, a modest savings account, a vegetable garden in the backyard that Lola maintained until she was 82, and an eldest daughter named Gloria who had been waiting, with increasing impatience, for decades to take control of what she considered the family's primary asset. That eldest daughter was my mother. My mother is a woman who has spent her entire life curating the image of someone who has everything under control. She dresses carefully. She speaks in complete sentences. She returns emails within the hour and never misses a church obligation. She is the kind of person who brings a dish to every potluck and then quietly ensures that everyone knows she brought it. She loves her family, or at least she loves the version of family that reflects well on her. And for as long as I can remember, the member of the family that reflected best on her was not me. That would be my sister, Camille. Camille is 3 years older than me. She is beautiful in the precise, conventional way that makes people assume competence before she opens her mouth. She got my mother's cheekbones and my grandfather's easy confidence, and she learned early that both of those things could be traded for enormous amounts of goodwill without having to work very hard for any of it. Growing up, Camille was the one whose school photos went on the wall in the large frames. Mine went in the small frames on the hallway bookshelf. Camille's volleyball games were events. My academic competitions were scheduling conflicts. When Camille graduated from a mid-tier state school with a communications degree and immediately moved back home because she couldn't find a job, my mother redecorated her old bedroom and told the neighbors that Camille was transitioning between opportunities. When I graduated 2 years later with a degree in accounting and a job offer already signed, my mother told her friends at church that at least one of her daughters was practical. Practical. That was always the word. Said like a consolation prize. Said like something you settle for when the shinier options aren't available. I moved across the country for that job. I worked long hours. I made sacrifices that nobody in my family acknowledged because nobody in my family was watching closely enough to notice. Over the following 6 years, I earned 2 promotions, paid off my student loans, built a small amount of savings, and called my grandmother every Sunday without fail because she was the only person in my immediate family who asked genuine questions about my life and actually waited for the answers. Lola and I had a different kind of relationship than she had with the rest of the family. Part of it was geography. When you are the one who left, and you come home only for holidays, the time you get with someone feels more precious and you spend it differently. Part of it was temperament. We were both quiet observers in a family full of performers, and that created a particular kind of understanding between us. But I think the biggest part of it was something she said to me the last time I sat with her in her kitchen, about 4 months before she died. She told me she had always seen me. That was the phrase she used. Not "I love you," not "I'm proud of you," though she said both of those things too. She said, "Marisol, I have always seen you." And the way she said it made clear that she understood exactly what it meant to be seen versus unseen in that family, and exactly which category I had been placed in for most of my life, and exactly why she wanted to say it out loud before she no longer could. She passed away 8 months ago, on a Tuesday evening in October, quietly, in the bed she had slept in for 50 years, with the window cracked open the way she always kept it because she said she could sleep better when she could hear the outside world. She was 86. The last thing she said to me, when I flew in and sat with her the weekend before, was a single sentence that I have turned over in my mind every day since. She said, "Everything is already taken care of, Anik. You just have to wait for the right moment." I thought she meant she had made peace with dying. I thought she was talking about the spiritual kind of taken care of. It took me 3 more weeks, a lawyer's office, and the look on my mother's face when a particular document was read aloud to understand what she had actually meant. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you first about the years in between. Because what happened at the end of this story only lands the way it does if you understand the weight of everything that came before it. After my grandfather died, the house became the thing the family organized itself around the way families always organize themselves around the thing everyone wants. My mother, as the eldest of Lola's 3 children, assumed early and without formal discussion that she would be the one to manage the estate when the time came. She was the one who lived closest. She was the one who helped Lola with appointments and grocery runs and the 1,000 small logistics of an aging woman's life. She did those things genuinely and without complaint, and I do not want to take that away from her, because it was real labor and it deserved real credit. But she also did those things with an expectation. She did them as an investment. And somewhere along the way, the investment started to feel like ownership. My Aunt Rosario, Lola's second daughter, lived 4 hours away and visited on major holidays. She was softer than my mother, less strategic, more interested in maintaining warmth than in acquiring assets. She deferred to my mother in most family decisions because it was easier than the alternative and because Rosario had learned, over decades of being the middle child, that fighting Gloria was a project with a very low return on investment. My uncle Benito, the youngest, had moved to Canada 20 years ago and maintained a careful, pleasant distance from all family dynamics. He called on birthdays and sent flowers when Lola went to the hospital and made it very clear, without ever saying so directly, that he trusted everyone to handle everything reasonably and would prefer not to be involved in any outcome that required him to choose a side. So for most of my adult life, the operating assumption in our family was simple. My mother was in charge of Lola. When Lola was gone, my mother would handle the estate. The house would likely be sold or transferred, the proceeds would be distributed, and the whole thing would resolve with minimal conflict because my mother was competent and organized and everyone trusted her with the numbers. What nobody factored in, except, it turns out, my grandmother, was Camille. Camille had moved back home at 24 and never really left. She stayed in her childhood bedroom, contributing minimally to the household expenses, while my mother covered the utilities and groceries and property taxes, which she did without objection because Camille was her golden child and golden children required different accounting. Camille worked a part-time job at a boutique for 2 years, then quit because the manager was difficult. She took an online certification course in interior design and never finished it. She began and abandoned a small Etsy business selling hand-lettered prints. She dated a series of men who were described by my mother as not quite right for her, which meant they did not have enough money or ambition or the correct last name, and she remained perpetually in the process of figuring things out, which is a luxury that only certain people are extended indefinitely without judgment. While all of this was happening, Camille also became Lola's daily presence in the house. Not by design, not with intention, just by proximity. She was there. She watched television with Lola in the evenings. She drove her to the pharmacy. She ate dinner with her every night while I was across the country eating dinner alone at my desk, finishing a client report. And my mother, watching this, made the calculation that all mothers like her eventually make. Camille had given something up, she decided. Camille had stayed. Camille had sacrificed. The fact that Camille had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and had given nothing up because she had nothing organized enough to sacrifice, was not part of the calculation. About 2 years before Lola died, the conversation started. Not openly, not at the family dinner table. It started in the way those conversations always start, in the margins of other conversations, in the pauses between sentences, in the things my mother said to my Aunt Rosario on the phone when she assumed I could not hear. She started framing Camille as the one who had done the real work of being present. She started framing me, carefully and without ever saying it directly, as the one who had opted out. Who had chosen career over family. Who had left and therefore, in some moral ledger she was keeping, forfeited something. I heard this framing reflected back at me in small ways every time I came home. How lucky you are that you got to build your career while some of us were here. Said sweetly. Said like it wasn't an accusation. I know it must have been hard being so far away when Lola needed things. Said with a sympathy that was actually a sentence, and the sentence was you weren't here, so you don't get to have an opinion about what happens now. I didn't push back. I should have, and I know that now, but at the time I was operating under the same assumption everyone else was, that there was a will, that the will was fair, that my grandmother was a woman of fairness and would not allow her estate to be distributed in a way that excluded her grandchildren unequally. I trusted Lola. I trusted the process. And I went back to my apartment after every visit and filed the discomfort away and told myself it would be fine. The week after Lola's funeral, my mother called me. It was a Saturday morning and I had barely slept. She said, I've been in touch with the estate attorney. We're scheduling a meeting next week to go over everything. You should fly back if you can. I booked a flight the same day. I took 3 days off work. I flew home with a careful, neutral face and the private hope that whatever Lola had arranged, it was fair, and whatever my mother had decided in her own mind, the documents would override it. The meeting was held in a beige conference room at the office of an estate attorney named Mr. Putnam, who had a firm handshake and reading glasses on a chain and the practiced calm of someone who spent his career delivering information to families who were not always ready to receive it. My mother was there. Camille was there, dressed carefully, in a silk blouse I had not seen before, sitting at the table like she was already the decision-maker. My Aunt Rosario attended by phone. Uncle Benito sent a brief email saying he trusted everyone and to keep him informed. Mr. Putnam opened by explaining that Lola had a valid will, executed in 2018, which divided her liquid assets evenly among her 3 children. He described the savings account, the small CD she had opened years ago, and some personal items. He read through it carefully. It was exactly what I expected. It was fair. Then he said, and regarding the property at 4412 Clemens Avenue. My mother sat up slightly. Camille folded her hands on the table. Mr. Putnam paused, turned a page, and then looked up at both of them over his reading glasses with an expression I could not quite read. He said, I want to ensure the family is aware, the property at 4412 Clemens Avenue is not part of this estate. My mother's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. She said, What do you mean, it's not part of the estate? Mr. Putnam said, the deed for the property was transferred out of Lord Velasco's sole ownership in 2003. It has not been hers to bequeath since that time. The room went completely still. Camille said, transferred to who? Mr. Putnam looked down at the document in his hand, and then he looked at me, and he said, to Marisol Velasco Cruz. The deed was registered in her name on April 14, 2003. She has been the legal co-owner of that property for the past 21 years. My mother turned and looked at me. And I want to be precise about what I saw in her face in that moment, because I have thought about it every day since. It was not confusion. It was not grief. It was the particular expression of a person who has just realized that the game they were certain they had already won was played on a board they never had full sight of, and that someone else, someone they had underestimated for 30 years, had been holding the winning piece the entire time. I did not smile. I did not say anything. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I looked back at my mother and I let the silence do exactly what my grandmother always said silence could do when you had the patience to let it work. To understand why she did it, you have to go back to 2003. You have to go back to a 9-year-old girl and a grandmother who was already watching, already calculating, already making arrangements for a future she could see coming the way certain women always can. I was 9. My grandfather had been gone for 2 years. My mother had already begun what I would later recognize as her campaign to position herself as the rightful heir to every decision in the family. She was not cruel about it in those early years. She was efficient. She showed up. She managed things. She made herself indispensable in the way that certain people do when they want to ensure that their presence cannot later be questioned or dismissed. But Lola was watching. And what Lola saw, in the long patient way she saw things, was that her eldest daughter loved power the way some people love oxygen, quietly, constantly, in a way they only notice when it is taken away. She saw that Camille was being shaped in her mother's image, collecting the affections of the room the way a magnet collects metal filings, not because of effort but because of proximity and performance. And she saw me. Quiet, serious, doing my homework at the kitchen table without being asked, inheriting her habit of observation without understanding yet why it mattered. On a Wednesday in April of 2003, Lola drove to the county clerk's office alone. She told no one where she was going. She brought the deed to the property, which was in her name and her name only following my grandfather's death. She had consulted, quietly and privately, with a real estate attorney she found in the phone book, not the family's attorney, not anyone connected to my mother, a stranger, selected deliberately for his disconnection from everyone she knew. She had the deed re-registered. She added my name to it as a co-owner, specifying a right of survivorship that meant if she died before I reached adulthood, the property would pass entirely to me, and that if she outlived my childhood, we would hold it together until she decided otherwise. She came home that evening and made dinner. She did not say a word. Not to my mother. Not to anyone. She filed the paperwork in a folder inside a locked metal box she kept in the back of her bedroom closet, underneath 40 years of birthday cards and a collection of handwritten recipes and a photograph of my grandfather on their wedding day. And she went about her life as though nothing had changed, because for her, nothing had. She had simply made sure that what was meant to happen would happen, regardless of what anyone else decided in the years between that Wednesday and the day she died. She never told me. Not once, in 21 years. I did not know. And that is the part that I keep coming back to when I think about the kind of person she was and the kind of love she carried. She didn't tell me because she didn't want me to carry the weight of it. She didn't want me spending 2 decades watching my back or bracing for a fight that she had already resolved. She wanted me to just live. She wanted me to build my career and call her on Sundays and visit on holidays and trust that she had taken care of what needed taking care of. And she had. She had taken care of it in 2003, when I was 9 years old and still small enough to fall asleep in her lap on the couch, and she carried the secret alone for 21 years so that I wouldn't have to. If that doesn't break your heart a little, I don't know what will. My mother did not speak to me for the remainder of that meeting. She asked Mr. Putnam 3 questions in a row, each one faster and tighter than the last, the way a person asks questions when they are not actually looking for information but are trying to locate a gap, an error, a procedural flaw they can squeeze through. She asked whether the transfer could be contested on the grounds of Lola's mental state in 2003. Mr. Putnam said that the documentation showed no evidence of diminished capacity at the time of filing and that a challenge of that nature would require significant legal effort with a low likelihood of success. She asked whether a co-ownership arrangement meant the property could not be sold without both parties' agreement. He said yes, that was correct, both named owners would need to sign off on any transaction. She asked, And this is the question that told me everything I needed to know about where her mind had already gone, whether there was any provision in the deed that limited the co-owner's rights based on years of residence or contribution to the property. Mr. Putnam looked at her steadily and said there was not. Camille said nothing through all of this. She sat beside my mother with her hands still folded on the table and stared at a point somewhere above Mr. Putnam's left shoulder, and the only sign that anything was happening behind her eyes was the slight, rhythmic press of her thumbnail into the side of her index finger. I had watched her do that since childhood. She did it when she was trying to work something out. When she was deciding which version of events would serve her best. My Aunt Rosario, still on speakerphone in the center of the table, said, very quietly, "Oh, Mama." And that was all she said. But the way she said it told me she was not surprised the way my mother was surprised. She was surprised the way you are surprised when something you suspected turns out to be true, not by the fact of it, but by the confirmation. I signed several forms that afternoon. Mr. Putnam walked me through the co-ownership documentation, explained what rights it conferred, and gave me a copy of the original deed transfer from 2003, which I folded carefully and put in my bag with both hands because I did not trust myself not to let them shake if I tried to do it with one. We shook hands at the end of the meeting. My mother walked out of the conference room without looking at me. Camille followed her, one step behind, as she always had. I sat in my rental car in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on the dashboard because it was the only thing in that moment that felt reliable and measurable and outside of myself. I did not cry. I was not happy. What I felt was something more complicated than either of those things, a kind of vast, aching gratitude toward a woman who was no longer alive to receive it, mixed with the slow dawning understanding of how long she had been carrying something on my behalf, and how alone she had done it, and how she had never once asked me to thank her or even to know. I drove to the house on Clemens Avenue. I still had a key. Lola had given it to me years ago and I had kept it on my carrying across every move, every apartment, every city I had lived in since college, the way you keep things that feel too important to take off even when you can't articulate exactly why. I let myself in through the front door and stood in the entryway and did not turn on the lights. The house smelled the way it had always smelled, like the particular combination of wood and fabric softener and something herbal from the kitchen that I have never been able to identify anywhere else and that I have come to believe exists only in that house and nowhere else on earth. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked to the kitchen and sat at the table where I had done my homework every afternoon from age 7 to 17, and I put my face in my hands, and I let myself feel all of it. The call from my mother came that evening. I was at my Aunt Rosario's house. She had driven down for the funeral and stayed for the meeting, and she had texted me after the parking lot to say come over whenever you're ready, and I was sitting on her couch with a cup of tea that had gone cold when my phone lit up on the cushion beside me. My mother's name on the screen. I picked it up. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not say she needed time to process what had happened. She said, "Marisol, I need you to understand that this is not what your grandmother intended." I said, "She signed the deed, Mom." She was not in a sound state of mind in 2003. She was grieving your grandfather. She may have been manipulated by whoever that attorney was. She may not have understood the full implications of what she was signing. I kept my voice completely level. I said, she was 63 years old and she had just successfully managed Grandpa's entire estate by herself. She was sharper in 2003 than most people ever are. There was a silence. Then my mother said, "You are not entitled to that house, Marisol. You haven't lived there in over a decade. You haven't contributed a single dollar to its maintenance. You don't even live in this state. Whatever your grandmother put on a piece of paper, the spirit of her intention was for that house to go to the people who have been present. Who have been here. Who have done the work." I thought about a lot of things I could say. I thought about the Sunday phone calls and the flights home and the career I had built without any help from anyone in my family and the degree I had paid for myself and the way the word practical had been said to me my entire life like it was a consolation and not a compliment. I thought about Camille and her silk blouse and her folded hands at the conference table and 20 years of being handed things she had not earned while I was handed the expectation that earning things was simply what I did. I said, I know what her intention was, Mom. She told me herself. And I'm going to honor it. My mother hung up. The next 3 weeks were the kind of quiet before a storm that you can feel in your teeth. My mother did not call again. Camille texted me once, a message that read simply, "You really want to do this to the family," and I did not respond. Rosario called me twice, once to check on me and once to tell me, in her careful way, that Gloria had been talking to people, that she was building a version of events in which I was the villain of the story, the greedy absent daughter who was exploiting a confused old woman's paperwork to steal what rightfully belonged to the people who had actually shown up. I listened to this calmly. I had expected it. My mother's first move in any conflict was always narrative. She understood intuitively that the person who controls the story controls the sympathy, and she had been practicing that particular skill her entire life. What she didn't know was that I had spent the 2 weeks since the meeting doing something she hadn't anticipated. I had not been sitting quietly waiting for the storm to pass. I had been talking to my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Gaines who specialized in property law and who had the particular quality I needed most in that moment. She was fast, thorough, and completely unmoved by the kind of emotional framing my mother was so skilled at deploying. Patricia walked me through the deed in detail. She confirmed that it was airtight. She confirmed that my rights as a co-owner were clear and legally enforceable. She also told me something that shifted the entire shape of what I was preparing for. She told me that the property had been generating rental income. I did not know this. Lola had not mentioned it on our Sunday calls, and I had never thought to ask because I assumed the house was simply the house, the family home, unoccupied except when relatives visited. But it turned out that for the past 4 years, while Lola was living primarily in a back bedroom she was comfortable in and rarely leaving, my mother had been renting out 2 of the 3 other bedrooms to a rotating series of tenants, presenting herself to those tenants as the property manager, and depositing the rental income, which Patricia calculated at roughly $1,100 per month at current rates, into an account that I had no knowledge of and no access to. 4 years. 52 months. Approximately $57,200 in rental income from a property that was legally half mine. I sat with that number for a long time. I turned it over the way you turn over something you have found on the ground that you cannot immediately identify, carefully, from multiple angles, trying to decide what exactly you are looking at before you decide what to do with it. Patricia said I had grounds to pursue recovery of half those earnings. She said that as a co-owner I was legally entitled to an accounting of any income generated by the property, and that managing that income without informing or compensating the other owner was a clear breach of fiduciary duty. She said we could file a partition action if my mother refused to negotiate, which would force a court-supervised resolution of the co-ownership. She said, in the measured tone of someone who has seen many family property disputes and has long since stopped being shocked by any of them, that my position was very strong. I asked her to give me a little time before we filed anything. She said she understood and told me to call her when I was ready. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What I was doing in that time was not hesitating. I want to be clear about that. I was not softening, or second-guessing, or hoping my mother would come around and make the harder steps unnecessary. I had stopped hoping for that particular outcome sometime in my mid-20s and I was not about to start again now. What I was doing was waiting for the right moment. Because I had learned from my grandmother that the right moment is not the same thing as the first available moment, and that the difference between those two things is often the difference between justice that lands cleanly and justice that gets tangled in the drama of its own delivery. The right moment arrived in the form of an invitation. Every year, on the last Saturday of November, my mother hosted what she called the family dinner. It was not Thanksgiving, she was very particular about this distinction. Thanksgiving was an American holiday, she said, and while she observed it, the family dinner was ours, a Filipino gathering, a chance for the extended family to eat together and catch up and maintain the web of connection that she positioned herself, always, at the center of. Aunts and uncles, cousins, family friends who had known my grandparents for decades, neighbors who had been eating Lola's cooking for 30 years, they all came. It was the one event every year at which my mother's version of our family was most fully on display, the version in which she was the capable matriarch, the devoted daughter, the woman who held everything together. She sent the invitation by group text, the way she always did. I was on the thread. She had not removed me, which told me she had not yet decided how to handle my presence publicly. She had not figured out whether it would look better to exclude me or to include me and perform magnanimity. I texted back that I would be there, and I booked a flight, and I called Patricia Gaines and told her it was time to have everything ready. Patricia prepared a packet. It contained the original deed from 2003, a certified copy obtained from the county clerk's office. It contained 4 years of property tax records, all filed in my mother's name alone, which was its own separate legal irregularity. It contained a forensic accounting summary of the estimated rental income for the period in question, sourced from comparable rental listings in the neighborhood and cross-referenced with a lease agreement Patricia had obtained through a former tenant who, when contacted, was more than willing to provide documentation once she understood the situation. It contained a formal letter, signed by Patricia, notifying my mother and any other parties in possession of the property that I was asserting my full rights as co-owner effective immediately, and that any further collection or management of rental income without my knowledge and written consent would be pursued as a financial claim in court. I put the packet in a manila envelope. I did not tell anyone I had it. I flew in on the Friday before the dinner. I did not stay at the house on Clemens Avenue, which I could have, legally, but chose not to because I did not want to signal my intentions before I was ready to act on them. I stayed at a hotel 12 minutes away and I ordered room service and I slept better than I had in months, which I think says something about what it does to your nervous system to finally stop waiting and start moving. The dinner was held at my mother's house, not the Clemens Avenue property. She had moved to a townhouse 5 years ago, another detail I had not been consulted on, and had begun using the Clemens house purely as a rental asset and occasional family gathering space for holidays when she needed the larger rooms. When I arrived on Saturday evening, the house was already full. I recognized the cars in the driveway. I could hear voices and music from the street. I stood outside for a moment. The night was cool and clear and somewhere 2 houses down a dog was barking at nothing. I thought about Lola in that county clerk's office in 2003. I thought about the folder in the metal box in the back of her closet. I thought about 21 years of a secret carried so quietly, so completely, that it had never once leaked into the ordinary texture of our Sunday phone calls. I thought about what it takes to love someone that carefully, that far ahead. I went inside. The living room was arranged the way my mother always arranged it for the family dinner, the furniture pushed back to create a flow between the dining table and the kitchen, mismatched chairs borrowed from neighbors to seat everyone, the good tablecloth that only came out twice a year. Platters of food covered every surface. The smell of garlic rice and adobo hit me the moment I stepped through the door and I felt, for one disorienting second, like I was 9 years old again and this was simply home. Then I saw my mother across the room, talking to 2 women I recognized from her church, and she saw me, and whatever she had prepared to show on her face in this moment, she showed it, a smile, warm, practiced, the smile of a woman who is publicly gracious to her children regardless of private disagreement. She said, "Marisol, you made it. Come get something to eat." I smiled back. I went and got a plate. I spoke to cousins I hadn't seen in over a year. I hugged my Aunt Rosario, who held on an extra beat and said nothing, which said everything. I found a seat at the end of the long table and I ate slowly and I watched the room the way Lola had taught me to watch rooms, not with suspicion, but with attention. Noticing who was talking to whom. Noticing what was being said and what was being deliberately not said. Camille held court at the center of the table the way she always did, the way a person holds court who has spent their entire life being the sun in their particular solar system and has never had to learn how to navigate as a planet. She was talking about the house. Not indiscreetly, she was too smart for that, but in the way of someone who cannot quite contain a thing they are excited about. She mentioned plans. Renovations. A fresh coat of paint on the exterior. She used the word "are" in a way that made my jaw tighten, and she said something about how it was going to be such a good space for the family going forward, such a legacy, and two of my cousins nodded along without knowing enough about the situation to understand what they were actually nodding to. My mother watched Camille talk, and her expression was the expression of a woman who believes she has won. It was subtle, she was too controlled for it to be obvious, but I had been reading her face for 30 years and I knew it. The slight looseness around her shoulders. The way her chin lifted a degree. The ease with which she reached for her glass. She thought the conversation in Mr. Putnam's office had been a shock, an inconvenience, but ultimately one she would manage. She thought I would negotiate. She thought I would settle for something smaller because I always had, because my entire life I had been the one who accepted the smaller portion without complaint, and she had read that as compliance when it had actually been patience. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and the coffee was made and the room had softened into the relaxed, scattered conversations of a well-fed family gathering, my mother stood and clinked her glass. She did this every year, a toast, a reflection, something warm and unifying that reminded everyone why they came and positioned her as the author of that feeling. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about Lola, about missing her, about carrying her memory forward. She said the family was the most important thing, that Lola had believed that above all else, that it was their job now to honor her by staying connected, by choosing each other, by keeping what she had built. People nodded. Someone at the far end of the table pressed their fingers to their eyes. Then she said, "We're also excited to share that we'll be making some updates to Lola's house in the new year. Keeping it in the family, keeping it as a gathering space. Camille has some wonderful ideas." Camille smiled. Someone said, "That's so lovely." Another person said, "Lola would have loved that." I set down my coffee cup. I reached into the bag beside my chair. I took out the manila envelope. I did not open it yet. I held it in my lap and I waited one more breath, the way my grandmother had taught me, not with advice, but with example, because she had waited 21 years and done it without making it look like waiting at all. I said, actually loud enough to carry through the room without raising my voice, "I'd like to say something about the house too, if that's all right." The room adjusted. Heads turned. My mother's expression did not change, but her stillness changed. It became a different kind of stillness, the kind that is not calm but the suspension of something that has not yet decided whether to move. I stood up. I kept my voice even. I said, "I know a lot of you have heard that Lola's estate is being sorted out, and I want to make sure the family has accurate information about the house on Clemens Avenue, because some of what has been circulating isn't complete." My mother said, "Marisol." A single word, a warning compressed into 4 syllables. I looked at her. I said, "I'll be brief." I opened the envelope. I took out the certified copy of the deed and I placed it on the table in front of me, facing outward so that the people nearest to me could see the document header and the date and the 2 names printed in the ownership line. I said, "In 2003, Lola transferred co-ownership of the Clemens Avenue property into my name. This is the registered deed. I have been a legal co-owner of that property for 21 years. The room was very quiet. I took out the rental income summary. I said, "For the past 4 years, the property has been generating approximately $1,100 per month in rental income. That income has been collected and managed without my knowledge, and without any accounting to me as a co-owner, which I am legally entitled to. The total in question is approximately $57,200. I heard someone at the far end of the table say, softly, "What?" I took out Patricia's letter and I set it on top of the other papers. I said, "I'm not here tonight to create conflict. I'm here because this is the family that Lola built and she would have wanted it handled honestly. I have an attorney. The documentation is complete. I am prepared to resolve this through negotiation rather than court, but that option has a window, and that window closes at the end of the month. I looked at my mother. She was standing behind her chair with both hands on the back of it, and the knuckles of her right hand were white against the wood, and the smile was entirely gone, and what was on her face now was the unguarded face, the one she almost never showed, the one that existed beneath the management and the framing and the careful curation of how things looked. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of room to maneuver and had only just realized it in this moment, in this room, in front of all the people whose opinion she had spent 30 years constructing. Camille said, her voice low and unsteady, "You are doing this here. You are doing this now. In front of everyone." I looked at my sister. I said, 10 words, measured, without heat, "I am doing exactly what Lola would have done." Nobody spoke. The fire in the corner of the room crackled once. Someone's coffee cup was set down on a saucer too hard and the sound was enormous in the silence. My Aunt Rosario had both hands pressed flat against the table and was looking at the ceiling. 2 of my cousins were looking at each other. The church friends were looking at the tablecloth. My mother said, finally, her voice stripped of everything but the bare frame of it, "This is not appropriate." I said, hiding 21 years of my grandmother's intentions wasn't appropriate either. But here we are. I put the papers back in the envelope. I sat down. I picked up my coffee cup. And I let the silence do the rest. The dinner ended early. Not with a dramatic walkout, not with raised voices or broken dishes, just the quiet, irreversible deflation of a room from which all pretense has been removed. People said their goodbyes carefully, with the slightly too deliberate warmth of guests who want to leave without appearing to flee. My Aunt Rosario squeezed my hand on her way out and said nothing, but her eyes said everything they needed to. My cousins hugged me longer than usual. The church friends collected their coats without making eye contact with my mother, which told me everything I needed to know about whose version of events they believed. My mother did not speak to me again that night. Neither did Camille. I drove back to my hotel in the dark and ordered tea from room service and sat by the window for a long time watching the street lights and feeling, very specifically, the absence of the weight I had been carrying since the morning in Mr. Putnam's office. It was not triumph. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of a thing finally being set down after you have carried it so long you forgot it wasn't supposed to be yours to carry. Patricia Gaines received a call from my mother's attorney 4 days later. My mother did not want to go to court. She did not want the forensic audit. She did not want, above all else, any further public airing of the details that had already circulated through every person who had been at that table, because in a family like ours, from a table like that one, information travels faster than any legal filing ever could. She wanted to settle. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Patricia handled it with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and was mildly bored by how straightforward the outcome was. My mother agreed to a full accounting of the rental income collected during the 4-year period. She agreed to repay my share, $28,600, through a structured arrangement that did not require her to liquidate assets immediately but did require her to sign documentation acknowledging what the money was and why it was owed. She agreed that all future decisions regarding the Clemens Avenue property would require my written consent. And she agreed, through her attorney rather than in any direct conversation with me, to make no further representations to any family member or third party about the ownership status of the property. Camille's plans for renovation were quietly dropped. I never heard them mentioned again. I want to tell you the part that cost me something, because I think it would be dishonest not to. My mother and I have not spoken directly since that Saturday evening. Not a phone call, not a text, not a message passed through Rosario. There is a version of this story where the confrontation cracked something open between us and allowed something better to grow through it, where she found remorse and I found forgiveness and we built something new from the rubble. That version of the story would be more comfortable to tell. But it is not this story. What I have instead is clarity. And I have learned, slowly, that clarity is not the same thing as coldness, it is simply knowing the shape of what you are looking at without flinching from it. What I did with my half of that inheritance is this. I flew to the Clemens Avenue house on a Sunday in January, the first clear weekend after the settlement was finalized. I let myself in with the key I had kept on my ring for 13 years. I walked through every room. I stood in the kitchen at the table where I had done my homework. I stood in the doorway of Lola's bedroom and looked at the closet where the metal box had been. My Aunt Rosario had given me the box after the funeral, not knowing what was in it, only knowing that Lola had said once that Marisol should have it, and I understood, standing there, the full length of what my grandmother had done. The patience of it. The precision. The love that is not soft and sentimental but structural. The kind that holds. I did not sell the house. I know that surprises people when I tell them, because the obvious move, the satisfying movie ending, would have been to sell it and walk away with a check and close that chapter entirely. But the house is not a chapter one want to close. It is the place my grandfather built. It is the place Lola kept her garden and her recipes and her photographs and her locked metal box of receipts for things that mattered. It is the place I did my homework and learned how to watch a room and fell asleep on a couch that smelled like fabric softener and something herbal I have never been able to identify anywhere else. I am not selling it. I am keeping it, and I am managing it, and the rental income it generates is mine, fully documented, every cent accounted for by a very good attorney who answers her phone on the second ring. I call my Aunt Rosario every other Sunday now, in the slot where Lola used to be. Rosario is not Lola, nobody is, nobody ever will be, but she has Lola's habit of asking genuine questions and actually waiting for the answers, and I have come to understand that this quality is rarer than almost anything else a person can offer you, and I am not taking it for granted. There is one more thing. A few weeks after the settlement, I went back to the county clerk's office. Not to file anything, everything that needed filing had been filed. I went because I wanted to see the original record. The actual entry in the ledger from April 14, 2003. The clerk found it on microfiche after a few minutes of searching and angled the screen toward me so I could read it. The entry was brief and administrative, the way those records always are: a property address, 2 names, a date, a notary's stamp. Nothing in it would tell a stranger anything about why it was filed or what it meant or the weight it had been quietly carrying for 2 decades. But I looked at it for a long time. I looked at my grandmother's signature, which I had seen on birthday cards and recipe cards and the back of photographs my whole life, looping, deliberate, exactly the same at 63 as it had been at 30. And I thought about her sitting in that office on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at school doing my homework and my mother was managing things and Camille was being Camille, and nobody knew where she was or what she was doing, and she knew that, and she did it anyway. Quietly. Precisely. With complete faith that the right moment would come, even if she was not alive to see it. I am my grandmother's granddaughter. I have always been. I just had to wait for the moment when everyone else finally understood it too. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.